Hello, YPL Bel Air. I just feel so honored and privileged for you guys bringing me in to share this evening with you and to talk about this incredible time we're in and to try and contextualize it better together. I hope you consider this a safe space for critiquing, exploring, and riffing off the ideas we're going to talk about. I'm going to try and pique your curiosity with some things. Um, I'm a futurist, like Brent said. There's about 5,000 of us as an association of professional futurists. And we're just people who love looking at what people are saying about the future and how do we learn from the best ideas and trends and models that are out there, the opportunities, the risks, open problems that we can see, and the disruptions that are happening all around us. Every catastrophe is an opportunity for learning, and sometimes we only get them once in a lifetime. This is certainly a once in a lifetime catastrophe that we're in right now. And I think there's a tremendous amount of learning that we're doing. I think the long run, the arc of history is so good for us, but there's many valleys on the way there that we have to walk through as well as we can. So with all that said, let me throw my slides up. When I looked at the list of people and the experiences that you guys have and are bringing to the table, I feel honored and privileged that we can share this time together and talk about what are the opportunities. How can we learn from what's happening to us right now and the bigger picture of what we're in. And my slides are available at foresightu.com/books. You can download them there. So if there's anything on that you want to look at later, there's notes, there's links you can click through there that might be helpful to you. So first, let me tell you who I am. I'm an entrepreneur, started and sold a successful company, 2 million in revenue. And it was before I was the age of 45. I don't know if that's YPO quality, but that's who I was. We had 5 locations in California. It was called Hyperlearning, and I sold it to a company called Princeton Review. I'm an educator. I'm a foresight and leadership coach. And for the last 12 years, I've also studied complex systems. Now, InQ talked about evolution as a higher purpose. I'm in a community of people who believe that we can talk about evolutionary development. Evolution is the process of creating variety and experimenting and exploring. And development is the process of keeping the system going, protecting it, and making sure that next generation comes along. And that's predictable. So you have unpredictable and predictable evolution and development, and the universe seems to use both of those systems to adapt. So my top clients of my consulting firm and my education group, Foresight University, are defense, intelligence, law enforcement, and there's teams and entrepreneur work that I do as well. You can see my education there. My biggest thing that I do, I think, now for the last 5 years is I'm a dad and a husband. InQ talked about being excited for now. Having my kids has fully brought me back in the amazingness of life, and every day seeing them learn. My youngest, 8 months old, just learned to walk in his walker today, and it just blew my mind to see how excited he was. And to think that that's happening everywhere right now. The next generation is always coming up behind us, and we're doing our best to help them. So everything I'm going to talk about tonight has kind of been cooked into a book that is available at foresightu.com/books. It's called Introduction to Foresight. It's written for leaders. I hope you download it. I hope you find something of value there. And there's also a 60-minute assessment that you and your teams can do. That's also at foresightu.com/books. And it helps you understand, whether you are an optimist or a pessimist and how you plan for the future. And what are the techniques that you like to use when you look at the past and when you look at the future and when you look at the present. Like InQ said, being excited for now is where all action happens. So the future and the past, when we think about both, should only be in service to what we're doing right here, right now. And we should know what our values are. We should know what our feelings and the feelings of everyone else are, because now is all that really matters. So as a futurist, I think it's important to say that. Let's widen our scope and look at some of the things that are happening now. And this is a very incomplete and personal list. I have 2 years of medicine and physiology. So for me, one of the most exciting things that I've seen in graduate work is that we're finally making immunotherapy work. We're figuring out the cellular signals that allow cancer to hide in the human body. This team at Stanford is one of the leading groups that did this 2 years ago. And I totally believe that over the next 10 years, there's going to be huge numbers of cancers people are going to die with, but they're never going to die of them because we know how to shut them down and keep them from growing. So that's pretty amazing. And we have these things like the Dexcom and the Abbott blood scanners. We now have these tiny little wires you can stick in your body, simple, cheap tools that are going to allow anybody who wants to monitor any one of these molecules in our body. And we're going to be able to see things like tumor markers long before we get cancer, find out when we have inflammation, have our little smartphone tell us, hey, you need to get up and take a break because your cortisol's through the roof right now. All this kind of stuff is clearly coming now because we're figuring this tech out. Solar power, the whole story of energy is absolutely amazing. It's now cheaper than coal, new installed solar. Soon it's going to be cheaper than natural gas. All of China is decarbonizing hardcore right now. We have groups like Tesla selling megapacks all over the world for storing wind and solar. We've got Tesla Powerwalls being used in people's houses, and those are going to get a whole lot cheaper in the next few years. Just an incredible story happening there. And for water, right now we have water stress. It's a big problem around the world. Israel solved that problem over the last 15 years by coming up with the cheapest desalination and the most environmentally responsible desalination in the world. They sold a plant to San Diego 5 years ago. They get 12% of all of its water directly from the ocean now from one plant. And Huntington Beach is going to get a plant. It's opening in 3 more years for 500,000 OC residents, 50 million gallons a day right from the ocean. This actually detoxifies our oceans, and it can use renewable energy to run it. Now, a lot of people are fighting this right now in California, the second plant. They're worried about it. They're worried about how we responsibly deal with the brine and the toxins we pull out of the ocean. But the thing to really understand is nature does this now and does it very well. And what's coming in the next 10 years is something called microbial desalination. We're actually figuring out how plants do desalination, and we're learning from nature. And that's why this stuff gets cheaper and more efficient and cleaner and greener every year. So the big picture of water, it's incredibly optimistic because it's a nanotechnology problem. And then we have things like computers getting smarter. For 10 years now, we've had computers that are starting to think like people. And that's called deep learning. This TED Talk, 6 years ago, still the best single talk I know. In 18 minutes, it'll kind of blow your mind and show you how smart computers are getting. 5 years ago, a company called NVIDIA figured out that they were an AI company. Their graphics boards that they use for running games, they discovered that they're excellent at running these deep learning devices. Their stocks increased 23-fold in the last 5 years, and it's still going up because these boards are going into everything, all kinds of things. We're just starting to get smart. And companies like NVIDIA are kind of like where IBM was in 1950. They're at the very beginning of a completely new kind of world. This deep learning is why we're going to have cars that are going to drive themselves in the 2020s. Now, it's possible most of what they're going to do is they're not actually drive people. What they're going to do is they're going to prevent cars from running into people, from swerving out of their lanes, from running over cyclists. It's called safety assist or AI assist. That's the kind of AI that everybody sees is coming because the AI can actually predict what you're going to do, and it predicts what's safe at the same time. And that's how Tesla's autopilot actually works. And air taxis are coming as well. You may have heard about these ideas of these Uber drones that carry people for the air. I've got this article you can see at the bottom of this slide that goes into all the reasons why these things are actually coming and why they're actually going to work. So getting around the city, solving urban gridlock, having these things be completely safe, having them be high enough you never hear them, all that stuff is coming, and cities are going to be just crazy different starting in the 2030s because, in 10 minutes you're going to get across the city and people are going to use vastly less cars because these networks are basically just going to be sitting up there like ant trails, scooting people around to the places that they want to go. And it's a really, really interesting thing to think about the nature of a big city in that world. Right now we have these things called smart agents, you know, Google's Assistant and Apple's Siri and Amazon's Alexa. They're not very personalized. If you saw the movie Her, a beautiful film 7 years ago, recommend it. It gives you an idea of what these things that we call personal AIs are going to be like, and they are different. A personal AI is something that actually has a model of what your values are, and it starts to guide you in what to view and read, who to connect with on your social network, what to buy, even how to vote, because these things, they're deep learners, are going to get twice as smart every few years, and they're going to be better and better advisors of yourself. And the data they use is going to be private, just like your email. The marketers won't have access to it. The tech titans won't be telling you what to do. You'll be training this little piece of you that is this learning system that's looking after your values. Very different kind of a world. A number of people are doing a lot of really interesting things in the tech space, and that's why we have these things called unicorns, right? We have companies that are over $1 billion or 10 billion, that's called a decacorn, in value after startup within 5 to 10 years. And they're everywhere, and many of them are Chinese. To just give you a little example of what's been happening in the last few years, here's 2017. Here's how some of the major stock companies changed, primarily because of all this tech. And in 2020, year to date, you can see the changes that have continued to happen. A company called Boeing lost half of its value in the last year because of a reaction to COVID. But Boeing is actually leading in these air taxis. And if you do any long-term investment, it's a great company to invest in because they're going to be a key part of that story. A lot of things that don't look so good. And in my book, I talk about these things as problems of progress. A study came out in 2013 saying half to a third of all jobs are going to disappear or significantly change in the next 15 years because of automation and AI. A McKinsey study of 3 years ago said, fortunately, that's mostly tasks and not jobs, but still, it's a huge amount of disruption that people have to face because of all of this change. Another huge problem is the rich are getting way richer than the rest of us. The middle and bottom half of America actually improving their income below GDP per capita and have been for the last 40 years. The top 1%, the top 0.01% is just kind of taken off, and mostly because of stock. And unfortunately in America, many of our employees, many of your employees of your companies are not invested significantly in the stock market, which is the fastest growing way to get all of this value. So we are seeing our real income get hurt, and our ability to have financial freedom and independence and get out of the debt slavery that so many people are in, and many kids, is hurt unless we are actually in these markets. So if that's one thing I would recommend, financial literacy, financial foresight, helping your employees think about, and your kids, that's one of them. We're polarized today. And these two books from the left and the right talk about the reasons why. Maybe we'll get to some of those issues in our chat. Fortunately, we've had this problem before, and we can see ways out of it. Now we're in this COVID world. You know, we've got 20 million jobs have been lost in the US so far, year to date. Only 40% of those have come back, and they've come back in not strongly as they originally were, more conditionally. 200,000 deaths in the United States, 10 trillion in global productivity is the estimated current loss. All the remittances that were going to all these people in these emerging nations, they've all dried up. So they're just really, really facing terrible times right now. We got institutional failures, mental health challenges. Tech titans are making huge gains. Amazon is up 600 billion in market cap so far because of this. And the futurists that I talk to say in 3 years, we're going to see telework and gig work and online shopping as the new normal for a lot of places. We're going to have more of these online and mixed events like the one we're having tonight for education and entertainment. Immunotherapies and biosurveillance are finally going to start working in that world. We're spending the money on them that we haven't been spending for decades, that we should have been spending. And we were warned of this problem a long time ago by many people. And Bill Gates' 2015 talk is probably the best single one I'd read. It's just to see how clearly we saw the problem, but we haven't spent the money. And now finally we are. So catastrophes catalyze change, and some networks are always improving. The KT meteorite causes us to accelerate out of the complexity of the early Earth. The ice ages caused a massive complexification of human technology, the direct response, and now COVID, we're seeing a whole lot of people benefiting. And really what we should be doing is understanding who is learning from this catastrophe. How do we help ourselves and our loved ones to also use those same strategies? So to do that, we have to talk about accelerating change, which really is the elephant in the room. This wait but why slide. I love this slide. It says, you know, we're here in this red spot in the curve, and we think things are going to keep going up at the normal rate they are, but unfortunately they aren't, because we live in a universe where it's actually super exponential change. Certain things are actually accelerating. And in college, we learned about 2 to 3% economic growth, and we learned the real economic growth, so-called GDP. The new economists tell us is like almost 4% for the planet. But what's really growing faster are things like the digital world. That's a space in red here at the bottom of the slide that it's going so fast, people don't understand it. Now, many of us have heard of Moore's Law. You know, every 2 years, computers get twice as powerful, and that's been true since 1965. What's going even faster than that, though, since 2000, since the start of the web, is information. Digital information has grown 55% a year, and that means 60% of the world's digital data was made in the last 24 months. That's been true since 2000. It's going to continue to be true for the rest of our lives. And that means there's a tenfold increase in data every 5 years. And so this world of big data, you know, we're in it, and learning from it is a key thing we all have to figure out how to do, because everybody out there is going to have more and more of this data, and some of it is really useful. So in 2030, 10 years from now, it's easy to predict there's going to be 80 times more searchable, trainable data about everything, 50 times more bandwidth. 5G is going to work for everybody then. 30 times more computing power per dollar, 5 times more internet connected everything. That's sensors, RFID tags, wearables, beacons, all that stuff is blowing up right now. 25 billion of them globally in 2030. 2.5 times more battery power density. So those electric passenger air taxis I told you about, they become affordable for fleets to run them in that world, to become $20 to get across town in 10 minutes. And this book, Machine Platform Crowd, by Bringelson and McAfee of MIT 3 years ago, said, look, let's summarize all this in 3 major trends. What's really creating value now is machines over people, platforms over individual products and services, and crowds of people versus the core, the hierarchy, and the traditional sources of power. So machines, platforms, and crowds are kind of disrupting everything. And these are reasons why the S&P corporate listed lifespan went from 60 years in 1960 down to 18 years today. You may have seen Exxon, Pfizer, Raytheon all delisted from the Dow this year. And who replaced them? Software companies like Salesforce. And that is the nature of the future. So the academics out there describe all this in terms of something called D&D. If you played that game in high school, it's a good way to remember what these 2 words are. So we're densifying, which means cities are winning over rural areas. Nano is winning over macro processes everywhere because it's way more efficient. And we're dematerializing. We're learning how to use bits instead of atoms, and how to use software instead of acting, how to simulate something to find the best rather than experiment in slow and expensive physical space. And these 2 books kind of summarize it. They're the 2 best books I'm going to recommend tonight for really understanding why this acceleration happens. It's kind of mind-blowing to realize 75% of Americans live in 3% of our land. And the truth is, it's going to be 85, 90% over the rest of this century, because cities are just going to get more and more crazy interesting. And we're in an age of peaks for physical systems. We hit peak autocracy in 1945, end of World War II. Peak farmland was in 1970. Peak deforestation for the world was 82, although we're still killing the rainforest, but total deforestation stopped then. That's how much we're replanting around the world. Peak CO2 per capita for the US was almost 12 years ago. Peak steel use for the world was 2010. We're recycling all the steel. We don't need to mine more. Peak car purchase in the United States was 2015, and peak oil demand is right now. World population is peaking at 8.5 to 9 billion by 2060. We're not growing fast right now. Fortunately, the collapse of growth of population is getting us to a place of sustainability. We have huge problems still, like climate change and collapsing wildlife populations, but we can see tech trends and rule sets that are going to help us solve those problems. So what's our economy doing? Because our economy is dematerialized, because it's shipping bits over atoms, it's doing this acceleration that we saw on the weight by Y curve. The knee of that curve is actually the Industrial Revolution. Because things are going so fast in the economy, because these bits and because this software is so valuable and uses so little resources to create value, half of all the economic wealth in human history was created in the last 20 years. And the next wealth doubling is going to happen in the next 16 years. And that's venture capitalist Kartik Gada in 2018. That's an amazing statistic. One of the most amazing things that I've learned in the last 10 years. Talk to economists and say, well, what caused that, John? What actually caused that slope switch that we saw, that knee of that curve in economic value over the last 1,000 years? Well, it was three things. We generated new beliefs, that was the Enlightenment. We got new technology, and that was the Industrial Information Revolutions. And we created new networks like property rights and corporate charters and patents and rule of law, democracy, mass education, and a middle class. And so it's beliefs, technology, and networks that really are the three ways we manage accelerating change. And what I'd like to suggest for our discussion is, what are your beliefs? And like InQ said, is love and ethics at the center of what you believe is important? What are your values around interacting with other people? Do you see the progress that's happening? Do you take responsibility for your actions? And then with technology, how effectively are you using it? Do you see its upsides and its risks? And with networks, how are you caring for and using your networks? Are you cooperating first, because that's what a network is, and competing second, fairly within the network, called co-opetition, where you lead with cooperation. And if you don't believe you can change your attitudes and beliefs, the easiest of these three to change and improve your happiness and your well-being, read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where he talked about how people who were able to monitor their own beliefs and attitudes, even in Nazi Germany, in the concentration camps, were able to take control of their own lives and their own attitudes and thrive and not be traumatized afterwards. So when we talk about how we reinvent in a world of accelerating change, we need books like Elevate, which say you start with overcoming self-limiting beliefs. And then you find your why. And then you set goals and create accountability. And then you work on your health and wellness. And then lastly, you try and establish routines, because good routines will become habits. And I love this book for helping us think about how to improve ourselves. And when we talk about values, I told you about my little complexity community. We published this book, a technical book in 2019. And we think that there's 2 evolutionary goals and 2 developmental goals and 1 mixed goal, or Evo-Devo goal, that all complex networks care about. That's innovation, intelligence, connectedness, security, and sustainability. Now, I don't know if this is true or not. It's my model for what really matters. These 5 things really matter, and there's values associated with each of those goals that are all important. And as you can see, this is a Gaussian distribution, which means connectedness, or empathy and ethics, love and ethics and morality are at the center of what all adaptive networks care about. It's what all 2-year-olds talk about 24/7. My 5-year-old talks about connectedness all the time. And these other values farther out, they're secondary values, right? They're important, but not as important as getting that empathy and ethics right. Now, a guy named Plato figured this out a long time ago in the book called Timaeus, and he simplified it to say we care about the good, the true, and the beautiful, and we care about the good the most. So there's 5 E's that you can get out of his work. Ethics, empathy, and empowerment are the good. Evidence seeking is the true. And expression and freedom and beauty, play is the beautiful. And so maybe this is a better simplification to think about these 5 E's and ask, how am I using them, and how do I create purpose and not just profit, right? Profit with purpose is this new expression that leaders are using. And Edmund's book, Grow the Pie, is a beautiful discussion of how leading companies are blending purpose and profit. And when you talk to the millennials, like Deloitte does, they survey them every year, they now believe that business leaders after NGOs are the second most important thing for creating positive change. It's not our faith leaders, it's definitely not our political leaders. And they are 50-50 mixed on the companies that they look at when they ask, is that company creating positive change or is it net negative? And that's a huge question we can ask ourselves in our own companies. How do I communicate what my value is, and do people see what purpose I'm bringing as I'm making a profit to my community? Andy Cooper, who won the YPO Social Engagement Network Leadership Award in one of your events, he is a leading impact investor or environmental social governance, ESG investor. And he says this whole field is exploding. And he also says most wealth is going to be generated in Asian countries over the next couple of decades. And we can all participate in that wealth with being involved in emerging markets and Asian index funds, and as well as our tech leaders here in the United States. And I would recommend you think about that, and you have your employees think about that, because Asia is creating a huge amount of positive value. And when you look at data, look for the pain points. It's a very famous story that Tony Hsieh almost turned down. He's a friend of mine. He almost turned down investing in Zappos until he learned these 2 things. Retail shoes were a $40 billion market when they asked for his investment in 1999, and 5% of customers were already buying shoes from mail order catalogs. That's how much of a pain it was in their mind to go to a shoe store. And that was what convinced him that this was actually something that would be of value. And you all know the story of what happened afterwards. There's so much we can learn from the data. When we get closer to our customers, we can find these pain points and we can come up with new services that people aren't seeing. So I'm going to end my discussion with 5 life priorities for reinvention. These are in the Foresight Guide. I call them the HRVW priorities. And health, of course, is the thumb. If you don't have your health, then you don't have anything else. Relationships, vision, work, and environment. These really are the most fundamental priorities, I would argue, for living a good life. And so you can ask yourself, how am I doing on each of these? And I'm just going to give you a couple of slides for each, and then we're going to have our Q&A. So for health, we've got these 8 things that my review of the literature are really important. Call them the DIES miss priorities. If you want to miss dying, you pay attention to these 8 things. And one of them is exercise. The tip I want to give for you in this brief tonight is that sauna is an exercise mimetic. It's the easiest form of exercise that modern humans can do. You sit in a hot box for 20 minutes and you do this massive metabolic exercise and cardiovascular exercise. You can read, you can talk, you can be on your waterproof iPad, you can meditate, whatever you want. You go in a hot box for 20 minutes, and a massive study that came out of Finland with thousands of people in their 40s and 60s followed over 20 years has shown that 20 minutes 4 times a week gives you 70% less dementia, 50% less cardiovascular disease of all types, 40% less death from all causes, and in animals they've shown 10% more longevity, not in humans yet because they haven't done that study. But I really want you to think about the value of getting a sauna at home, either an infrared or one of these barrel saunas, and sitting in that hot box like Rhonda Patrick would say, because it's going to be a standard of care for people in the future, people that are getting older. It's an amazing thing, and I have one of these myself in my home. For reinventing relationships, I'd like you to think about psychological safety. Amy Edmondson at Harvard did all this amazing work, and my wife at Google on the rework team, they studied 100,000 Google employees and the top teams, and they found that psychological safety feeling safe to express ideas, debate, ask questions, admit mistakes. When you're a leader that provides psychological safety and models it for your team, it's the number one thing that creates performance and innovation on teams. And if any of you run Scrum, and I recommend this book here on the left, you know the 3 Scrum questions. What did you do yesterday? What will you do today? And do you have any external or internal blocks? These 3 questions you're supposed to ask for 5 minutes every morning in your stand-up meetings, 10-minute stand-up meetings. Number 3 is a psychological safety question. People will not share with you what their blocks are unless they feel safe from ridicule, sarcasm, snark, intimidation. You've got to make sure you have that, and then everything gets better in relationships. For vision, I'm going to give you 3 slides because I'm a futurist. First, study your network, see who's getting advantage. Inc. has the 5,000 fastest growing private companies. I totally recommend their magazine for seeing who's actually thriving right now and adapting and how. And I want to recommend a superpower to you. I want to recommend reading 1 new book or magazine a week. It could be The Economist, it could be Business Week, or it could be an actual book. If you do this, if you spend the same amount of time that you would spend watching a movie, 1 to 2 hours, you skim and scan for the most interesting things. You create a little personal index on the inside of the books, and then you teach that book in a 5-minute lightning talk, what you learned from it, to somebody else. You have a superpower. This is what we call great inputs leading to great outputs. And you can do this with podcasts as well. You get yourself some of these wireless buds. Here's my 5 best podcasts in all 5 of these areas. You just sit and listen to one of those while you're working, while you're driving or whatever, and great inputs lead to great outputs. You cannot stop generating all these great ideas because you've got the vision coming in. For reinventing work, I just have 2 things for you to think about. First, if you can reward performance with freedom, you will unlock incredible motivation on your teams. Google popularized this idea that an average performer or above gets 1 day a week to experiment, do evolution with whatever they think might be useful. Gmail came out of that, YouTube purchase came out of that, Google X all came from this so-called 20% time, and here's a good book that tells you how to do it. Finland did the same thing for their education system, for their entire country's educational system. They were ranked in the middle of the OECD countries in STEM and reading and critical thinking on the PISA scores. Now they are always number 1, 2, or 3 in the world on those scores. And the way they did it is they threw out half of their tests and curriculum and replaced it with freedom. Every student who gets average or above on the tests gets 30% time, 1/3 of their time in school, doing whatever they want, Montessori style. And kids are so incentivized by that freedom, they nail their tests. And there's great resources for them, for shop, for tech, for arts. There's even entrepreneurship resources, kids starting businesses in high school in Finland. You watch this movie, The Finland Phenomenon, which is free on YouTube, 63 minutes, and it'll kind of blow your mind to see what the future of education could be like if we were giving people freedom for performance. The last thing I want to mention is your environment. Find an exponentially aware community. Here's 2 that I recommend: Singularity University and OpenXO. Both of these are excellent groups who understand the stuff we've been talking about tonight, and they will help you think through how to use technology in a positive way. So my concluding slide: we can build better companies and better lives if we use foresight. I've got this free book for you. You and the universe are amazing people, and I want to thank you for this time.
Thank you, John. Okay, folks, so in terms of questions, for folks at home, if you put them in the chat, we'll be able to go through those. And we've got a microphone up here. I'll kick off with a question, but please don't be shy. We've got an incredible resource here. So, John, Maggie and I, we've got a 2-month-old kid, which has just been an amazing new experience. And we didn't put it on social media. We were trying to figure out what the future of privacy looks like. I feel like this is one I'd love your thoughts on, about privacy and sort of what's the future of privacy.
Man, it is such an important topic. Facebook failed so badly in monitoring not only the content that we were getting, but what we were saying to others and what we wanted others to see. There's a book called The Transparent Society, came out in 1998, and it basically argued that as long as we have the same tools for monitoring the powerful actors, then we will allow them to have more tools to monitor us. But privacy and anonymity are two different things. We have to protect secrets. We have to protect trade secrets. We have to protect what we say inside of our own houses. And right now in America, we can all record each other with our Skype or with our Zoom, but we don't share that without permission because there's laws in place to keep us from doing that. So people just need to be educated more and more on what is acceptable and what is not. In America right now, huge amounts of insider trading is going on because corporate transparency is so weak. It's so easy for people to trade on information that they know ahead of the market. But we can see a world where there's going to be more transparency. There's a lot more transparency of corporate and email in Europe. And as a result, there's a lot less insider trading because people know that that data can be subpoenaed and you can know who knew what when and whether they were acting appropriately. And so I think in general, this question of transparency and privacy, it's a huge issue we're going to continue to grapple with. But we see places like Europe with its data protection, GDPR laws, and now California that has created its own model version of the general data protection privacy laws. We can see states like ours and places like Europe are going to lead in this, and we're going to feel more like what we want to protect is protected, and there are consequences when people share it. But I'd love to hear what other people think on this issue of privacy. It's such an important one. We have to feel safe to share and safe to talk about things and know that that information is not going where we don't want it to.
That's great. Anybody want to kick it off? I have a ton of questions. I'm going to just roll through if somebody doesn't get up here. Okay, John, I've spent a lot of time in China and have seen the size of what's coming over there. You want to talk a little bit about those numbers and how it compares to us?
Yeah, well, so China is just, oh man, it's just an unbelievable place. And understanding its benefits and its drawbacks, I think it's so important for us to be able to do that. Let me just share a few slides that didn't make it in. So in the last 10 years, China built more high-speed rail than the rest of the world combined. They poured more concrete in the last 8 years than America poured in the last, I think, 50. They're tying together two areas into 120 million and a 90 million megacity, two different megacities by 2040. They got 8 of the world's top 20 construction firms. They are what's called the next factory of the world in Africa. So they're actually developing Africa after decades of Americans not being able, with our aid programs, to actually develop and improve many of these places in Africa. And they're hiring African locals to run these companies, these manufacturing companies, because labor's too expensive in China now, right? And they're losing 5 million workers a year because their population is shrinking. So China is just this juggernaut. It's America's first near-peer competitor. We've never had one of those before. Their labor productivity is growing 7% a year, the economist said. America has gone actually negative over the same time. And huge amount of their GDP is devoted still to building and manufacturing things. And they're making some pretty amazing things and sending it here more and more high touch now. They're more and more really listening to their customers, which they weren't doing 10 years ago. You know, they are the poverty escaping generation, right? 400 million people escaped poverty around the world in the last 10 years, and half of those were in China. And the really scary thing a lot of people see is kind of how hardcore they're going into AI now. They're building this kind of dystopian surveillance state using AI. You can get ticketed walking across the street because the facial recognition software sees that you're jaywalking, and it will debit your phone. It will debit your account automatically now in Shenzhen, for example.
They didn't have my bank account, but I know I'm on a database somewhere.
It's just unreal. And so we are looking at the negative side of that and seeing just how much of a dystopia they can create. And that actually is a tremendous leadership opportunity for us, because they have intrinsic leadership and AI weaknesses because of their lack of freedom and their very low political criticism and low social diversity. They have very restricted social innovation relative to us. So their business AI isn't going to be trusted. And their personal AIs, these tools that are coming that I mentioned that we're going to be using to empower ourselves and our groups and our activism, they're going to be hugely restricted compared to what we see in the West.
I really want to come back to the personal AIs, but the TikTok, WeChat, our data is somehow in nefarious hands. How worried are you about that?
I think those are all real issues. We should play hardball now around those issues. The standards that they're trying to set for 5G and the world, we're trying to set the standards at the same time. Whoever sets those standards is kind of at the center of the hub. So it's a huge battle right now. And Ian Bremmer talks a lot about it. Just go to his blog, the Eurasia Group, and he talks about this. It's really just the US and China that are this massive tug of war around the future of tech right now and the future of digital. I think they're important issues. I'm glad we're in that fight. And I think America, actually, the Sinosphere versus the Anglosphere. This is how The Economist frames it. The Sinosphere is all the Asian countries under China's influence, and the Anglosphere is all the English-speaking countries and all the open Western democracies. So the Nordic democracies in Germany, all the so-called ABCAN countries, America, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. That open versus closed network battle, open is going to win. It's clearly going to win, but we have to be moral leaders, and we've fallen away from that, as everyone knows, for the last decade, some say longer, and we have to come back around. We had all these unsanctioned wars that we sold to the American public after 9/11 that were based on manufactured data. Then we had the GFC that we leveraged onto everybody in 2008. We have lost a lot of moral leadership, but that's America alone. The open countries, the ABCAN countries as a whole, and the entire open Western democratic model versus autocracy, that is strong and accelerating. And we can look to the Nordic democracies to see where America has to go in 20 years. I'm completely convinced of that, and so are many others. They call those sentinel countries. So you want to see the future, you go to Norway, you go to Sweden, and you see where everything goes when we get a lot richer and a lot more responsible about our leadership.
Okay,
so that's my 2 cents.
Last question, short question. You and I have talked about personal AIs for years, and I love the idea of an agent in the cloud sort of operating, on my behalf and,
Yes, sir.
and doing all the mundane stuff that I don't want to do. Do you trust this? How do you keep AIs from taking over the world and creating a dystopian, terrible place?
So InQ talked about the valleys on the way to getting the optimistic future, and how it's so easy for you to fall down and not rise to the challenge, right? And the importance of rising to the challenge. The challenge is that we're going to go through a dystopian valley first with these technologies. That the first versions of these, they're going to come from Amazon, they're going to come from, say, a not responsible Facebook or somebody else. They're going to come from an Xfinity. We're going to be using these things, and they're not going to care about our bank account. They're not going to care about empowering us. They're going to be designed to transfer the maximum value to the tech leaders and the people who own those networks. Fortunately, the way the digital space works, it is a mostly bottom-up, mostly open network. There's 15 million people who code and throw their code up on a platform called GitHub, the Facebook for coders. It has 51 million pieces of code, 3% of which are deep learning code. And that world of deep learning, that code is just going to explode over the next 20 years. And the interesting thing is Google and Facebook and Amazon, all these tech titans, they throw all their crown jewels up, all their leading AI tools and platforms. They make them freely available on GitHub and to the open source community. And the reason they do that is because Google's 50,000 coders can't hold a candle to all the open community that are making things. So because there is a Linux to keep, say, Microsoft from being too extractive, because there are open AIs now, there are open versions of Amazon's Alexa, something called Mycroft. There are open personal AIs. There are open alternatives to Spotify. There are even open social networks. Because those platforms are going to continue to exist, I'm convinced that it might be 15% of us that really care about being over-manipulated who are running the open source version of the personal AI. But that's going to be built by all of us. We're going to know that it has our values front and center. And all the data on that are going to be private. And it's going to be encrypted, because you can always encrypt something so well that even the intelligence agencies can't get into it. So the ability for us to protect what we care about and to band together in groups and protect our values, the whole open ethos of the digital community from its very beginning is always a backstop to what happens with the proprietary actors. So I can see lots of problems ahead, lots of threats. I can see huge fights over access to these tools. The future of advertising. I want your folks in advertising and media to think for a second about a world within 20 years where your personal AI is keeping you from ever seeing whole classes of ads again that don't reflect your values. Not just a negative screen on tobacco and fossil fuels ads, but a negative screen on a car ad because you're never ever going to buy a car. And that is a world where the only ads that are going to get through are going to be ads that reflect your values, ads that your friends have recommended, or ads that are local and it might give you some potential benefit. Yeah. In the digital advertising space today, there's a small group of people, look at the Open Media Alliance, that are actually talking about the future of those kinds of ads. The rest of advertising doesn't even see this coming. This is a huge battle that's coming that I think is going to make the nature of our digital space vastly more reflective of what we want, and that's going to be a very good thing.
Fantastic. Wow. Well, hey, John, thanks so much for your time. Folks, a round of applause for John Smart.
Thank you, guys.